This short talk is about a 19th century nurse called Elizabeth Logan, whom Florence Nightingale in 1856 described as one of my best nurses in the Crimea, which is praise indeed from such a source. I first became interested in Elizabeth Logan when I read in the memorial inscriptions of St Michael's Church in Lichfield this entry: sacred to the memory of Elizabeth Logan, who died February the 28th, 1878. Having acted with Miss Nightingale in the Crimea on her return, she followed the profession of sick nurse, for which she was eminently qualified by her skill and experience. A strong sense of duty and great kindness of heart. No one who witnessed her self-denying exertions in aid of suffering humanity could ever forget them. Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. That last quote, of course, being from a parable told by Jesus. So it left me with two questions. Who was Elizabeth Logan? And would it be possible to find out where her grave was in St Michael's Churchyard? We'll look at both those questions. Who then was Elizabeth Logan? That's a picture not of Logan, but of Florence Nightingale. We know from various census returns that Elizabeth Logan was born in Glasgow in 1812. She was a Scotch Presbyterian. In the 1861 and 1871 census records, she appears as Mrs., which would suggest, as there's no sign of a husband in the 1850s when she went to the Crimea, she was married sometime before 1850, perhaps. She was widowed sometime before 1855. No indication of any children. Or it's possible that Mrs. is an honorific used by nurses. Some uncertainty there. Not helped by the fact that the Scottish census records, the early Scottish census records, haven't been fully transcribed and aren't easily searchable. There are no obvious Elizabeth Logans that stand out in the record. There are quite a few of them, but none that seem particularly relevant. But we do know that she was recruited by Lady Canning for Florence Nightingale in the Crimea and was to be paid 18 shillings a week. She was recommended by Dr. Simpson and others at the Committee of the Nurses' Home in Edinburgh. So she went to the Crimea, a map that's looking there, very familiar, following today's goings on. You can see the Crimea there on the back sea. At the time, it was part of the great game between the various European empires, the Ottoman Empire in the south, the Russian Empire in the north, with the Ottomans being supported by the French and the British. And the fighting was focused on the Crimea. And of course, there was carnage there and very, very poor conditions for the wounded. And it was really not a very well fought military campaign that ultimately led to the charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava, with massive fatalities. It's always puzzled me that Britain has idolised almost one of the major military disasters of the 19th century. But of course, there is a reminder of that in St Michael's Churchyard, where there is the grave of trumpeter John Brown, who was one of those who blew the trumpet to start the charge of the Light Brigade and was buried. He survived and was buried very much later in St Michael's Churchyard with full military honours. The events there led, of course, to the legends, almost a myth, of Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp. But Elizabeth Logan, she served with Nightingale at Castle Hospital in the Crimea, taking over from a party of Irish nuns. Nightingale describes her as sober, respectable, a kind and excellent nurse, surgical, very clever at her business, industrious and thoroughly trustworthy, also a good washerwoman and very clean. Cleanness was important. I think Nightingale's great contribution at the time was to recognise that much of the death was caused by appalling hygiene conditions. When the Crimean War ended in 1855, 1856, Elizabeth Logan went home. Nightingale writes to her friend Lady Canning in 1856, "My probable last letter to you is merely to say that Elizabeth Logan, a nurse whom I have sent home by the Ottawa, is, on the whole, the one I consider the most respectable and sober, efficient, kind, and good of all my nurses, the one I most hope not to lose sight of, the one I have the deepest regard for. She wishes for a private situation. If she comes to you for a character, I think you may be perfectly safe in recommending her. She is an excellent nurse," which, as I said, is praise indeed from such a source. There's some correspondence from Elizabeth Logan to Nightingale later in the year. First of all, to make the mild complaint that my wages had not been settled by the Ministry of Defence or Ministry of War or whatever it was at the time. And then in February the following year, to thank Nightingale for the Sultan's gift and for her help in securing my present agreeable situation. It would be wonderful to know what that Sultan's gift was. We don't actually know what that particular situation was, but we do know that in 1861 she was a nurse at Mapley Hall in Nottingham, and there you can see the register entry. And there she was looking after Captain Ichabod Wright of Mapley, who was to die in 1862 at the age of 95. So she nursed him through his final years. He was a quite eminent soldier. In 1863, she was again requesting a reference from Florence Nightingale, who again wrote, "She was one of my best nurses in the Crimea area. Now she is neither young nor strong, and therefore cannot take heavy nor temporary cases. But for long and suffering cases where constant vigilance and kindness, more than running up and down stairs, is required, I scarcely know her equal. She has had 3 such periods of 2 or 3 years each since she returned with me from the Crimea, and her nursing was beyond all praise. It made the comfort of the individual's life." We do know that in the final years of her life, she actually took up a post of nurse in the establishment of Admiral William Parker of Shenstone Lodge. And he died in 1866, so one can presume that she was there from 1863 to 1866. Shenstone Lodge still exists, and there's a picture of it there. After that, we lose sight of her, and a bit of a mystery arises. In the Nightingale Society records, we read that Elizabeth married Sergeant Tighe sometime around 1866. Tighe simply can't be traced in the records. I can find no mention of him at all. So, was it a short marriage? Desertion, perhaps? Reversion to the Logan name? Don't know, it's all a bit of a mystery. But we do know that in 1871 she was living in Market Street in Lichfield, not in any of the great houses, but simply as a lodger above a grocer's shop. And we do know, actually, can locate the house pretty much where she lived. There's Market Street, corner of Bird Street, 1880, actually, a few years afterwards. Not quite sure which and she was living in the first house round the corner from the census records. Not quite sure which one it was. And there's Market Street today from Google Earth. Whether it was the one on the left or the one on the right, I don't know, but that's where she was. But it was a very different situation from nursing fairly wealthy individuals. And perhaps at this time she took on rather a different role. I speculate that she took on the role of a local nurse, a district nurse, if you like, in some form, and looked after a number of people while living in lodgings in the centre of Lichfield. Again, it's hard to know. But what we do know is that she died on February 28, 1878, and was buried a few days later by the Reverend James Sargentson. And her address was given at that point as being in Dam Street in Lichfield. And there again is the memorial that was written on her gravestone. Now, the next question that arises is, where is her grave? And to begin to do this, you have to understand a bit of the history of St Michael's graveyard. In the 1960s, the graveyard was full of graves, and there was a proposal to level all these graves and to grass the graveyard and to put it into much the form we see now. But there was a very extensive survey carried out of the graves. And this bit of the survey, on the left, we can see the east end of the church. And Elizabeth Logan's grave was where that red circle is, some way away from there. We can locate it pretty precisely because there is a grave of one of the 19th century rectors there called Otto Steele, and that grave is still in existence. So by lining up Otto Steele's grave with the east end of the church, we can be fairly precise about where she was actually buried. But after the 1967 survey, all the gravestones were moved. It's possible, and then in the 1980s, a survey was carried out of memorial inscriptions. And by seeing where the memorial inscription occurred in the list, it's possible to identify roughly what the grave headstones were around her. Basically, they were all moved into clusters, and the 1984 survey suggests that her grave was put into cluster E there, not very far away from where her actually grave was. So I duly went to look for it. There is cluster E. And I spent a good 2 or 3 hours off and on over a week or two traipsing around there looking for that grave, and could find absolutely nothing. Then I visited it again with my wife, and it took my wife all of 90 seconds to find it. And the reason she found it and I didn't was I wasn't looking down at ground level. So that's the state of the grave headstone when we found it. It was cleaned up a little bit by the payback team, and that is its current state there, lying on the ground. So we actually found out a bit about Elizabeth Logan. There's more to be found out, I think. There are records I haven't yet looked at. I'd like to mine the Scottish censuses a bit more, perhaps look at newspaper records to see if anything can be seen. But we found out a bit about her. We found out where her grave is. So what comes next? Well, there is a proposal to restore the grave, crowdfunding helped by the Nightingale Society. The estimate for that is about £2,500, and perhaps re-erect that headstone on the site of the original grave. We're thinking perhaps a well-publicised rededication ceremony might be appropriate. I do apologise for the American Z in publicised there. It seems to have crept in without me noticing. And perhaps being used as a focus of prayers for healing and serving ministries. There's also some discussion of naming the new parish rooms the Elizabeth Logan building. So that's what we know about Elizabeth Logan and about her grave. There'll be more to add to that story in the future. Thank you for listening.